Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to introduce you to our first speaker of the main session. The first speaker is the Mr. Gonzalo Chiafello, climate change expert of chaos, Borboleta's Zustand Vladat, and he's going to make a presentation on the overall prospects of a global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. So now I'd like to invite him onto the stage for the presentation. Please welcome him with a warm round of applause.
So good afternoon, and I would like to thank you all for being here and thank GIR and PATPA for the invitation to be here. It's for me a great privilege to participate, even if in the last day of what I think is the most prestigious greenhouse gas inventory training course in the world. Everyone knows about this, and so it's quite important for me to be able to share some of my knowledge, something of what I know about the key topic of our conference today, the global stocktake. And before I begin, may I just ask a raise of hands to anyone who has learned, who knew something about the global stocktake before coming or preparing for this conference. If you knew about the global stocktake before, could you please raise your hand? Okay. I don't think I would know anything about the global stocktake if this wasn't my job, so I don't think you need to be concerned about the fact that you don't. Maybe you should be concerned if you knew anything about the global stocktake. I would like to thank Ambassador Kim for making my work easy, because she presented the key highlights of the global stocktake from a first-person perspective. Someone who's very engaged in the negotiations under the Paris Agreement on this topic. So what I will do is to provide you with a very basic guidance or guidelines on what the global stocktake is, what has been done so far, and what is expected to happen in the future. So very basically, the global stocktake is a collective mechanism to increase national ambition. So basically, as you know, under the Paris Agreement, and as was discussed this morning, each country submits a nationally determined contribution to the global efforts to implement the Paris Agreement. So each country decides what, in all fairness and with the highest level of ambition, each country decides what their contribution is going to be. As such, we need to get together and see if whatever each country is doing, when put together in a sum, in a global effort, is enough to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And then you will see that the global stocktake, or the GST, is part of a cycle which, under the Paris Agreement, is never ending, as it goes from the submission of NDCs to taking stock of what is happening, to submission of new NDCs, implementing new NDCs, and in the meantime here, submitting greenhouse gas inventories and biannual transparency reports, including information on what each country is doing. So the whole goal is that whenever we determine that we are not on track, or that we are not doing enough to meet the Paris goals, then that we collectively determine what we all should do in order to keep track. So this is exactly what was agreed in Paris, is to periodically take stock of the implementation of the agreement to assess collective progress towards the agreement and its long-term goals. So the global stocktake is not assessing what each country is doing. It's not assessing what Korea or Portugal or South Africa or Uganda or India or Brazil is doing. It has found a way to look into what we all are doing as a whole, as a planet. But as was just referred, it's not only about reducing emissions. because the Paris Agreement has 3 goals. Some even say that there are more goals in the agreement, but let's focus on the 3 main goals. So the first main goal is the global temperature goal, and we all know that the Paris Agreement is asking us to stay well below a global temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and always keeping in mind the effort to limit this temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is to protect some ecosystems and some countries even, which would be highly endangered if the 2 degrees C global temperature increase would be met. In order to achieve this goal, science has it very clear that as a whole, the whole world needs to be net zero emissions or carbon neutral by the middle of the century. So the very first goal is the one which we all know about because it's very much quantitative in terms of temperature and in terms of where we need to be in terms of emissions. The second goal, put very broadly, is related to enhancing resilience and adaptation to the key climate impacts. No matter how much effort we do to limit temperature increase, some impacts of climate change will be felt, are already being felt. So we all know that we need to work towards increasing resilience and enhancing adaptation to this changing climate. And finally, the third goal of the Paris Agreement is to align financial flows with these 2 objectives. So basically, making sure that the global financial flows, all kinds of financial flows, private and sector, private and public, that they are all aligned to make sure that we achieve this goal and this goal. For instance, this is where the discussion of reducing subsidies to fossil fuels, for instance, comes from. Because attributing subsidies to fossil fuels somehow seems not aligned with the goal of achieving net zero emissions by the middle of the century. So these are the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement which we are taking stock currently in the context of the GST. So the reason why we are doing the global stocktake is to influence national policy-making process. As I said in the first slide, we have the NDCs, which are then reported on through greenhouse gas inventories and biannual transparency reports. And then we have the global stocktake, and then we do NDCs again. But each country is still going to decide what their nationally determined contribution is going to be. So the idea is that once we come to the end of this global stocktake process, there is some message that we all send to each other collectively, and that this message is then digested and used to influence the national policy making at home. So basically, when countries are updating and revising their nationally determined contribution for 2035, that they take into account the outcomes of the global stocktake. So very briefly, how does it work? How does the global stocktake look at what has been done collectively, and how does this then transformed into messages that countries will use to inform their policy-making process? So there's these first 2 steps, and this little thing here should be just on these 2. So the first step is information collection and preparation, and the technical assessment. And these 2 first steps have been concluded in June. It was a process for 2 years, and it was concluded in June. And finally, the outputs of this exercise are going to be considered in Dubai COP28. So what kind of information is collected and has been assessed in the context of technical dialogues? So we were looking for, and of course this was negotiated very hardly among countries in the context of the Paris Agreement, but we are looking into state of greenhouse gas emissions, mitigation efforts, the overall effect of nationally determined contributions, efforts related to adaptation, financial flows, and means of implementation and support provided from developed countries to developing countries, barriers and challenges that countries have faced, good practices, it's always good to learn from each other like we were trying to do this morning, and fairness considerations. Is it fair that I'm making an effort and my neighbor is not, and vice versa? So these are the types of information which we were looking for. So where was this information coming from? Reports from parties. This is in the spirit of the global stocktake, the core of the information. So we're talking about national communications, greenhouse gas inventories, biannual update reports, and in the future, biannual transparency reports, which are the reports to be submitted in the context of the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. So the first global stocktake has been done without these reports which are being created under the Paris Agreement. So we are still using reports from the old guidelines that were there. In addition to reports from parties, which are the core, we have reports from the IPCC, which have been mentioned, reports from the subsidiary bodies, which are bodies under the convention which do a lot of work in terms of implementation and in terms of science, reports from other constituted bodies like the Adaptation Committee or the Santiago Network, for instance, in the future, from UN agencies like UN Women or UN Habitat or UNEP or UNDP, submissions from parties and non-parties. So if a specific country wants to make a specific submission of their views on the global stocktake, they are welcome to do it. And in particular, non-party stakeholders are also welcome to do it. And then finally, the synthesis report prepared by the Secretariat as a result of these technical dialogues. So the outputs of the technical assessment. So there has been these dialogues, which were meetings among parties, among countries, among non-party stakeholders like research institutes, NGOs, companies, trade unions. These technical dialogues to assess this information which has been collected took place over 3 sessions. The last one was in June in Bonn. So after each session, a summary report is being produced. And this summary report is not a negotiated text. It's just a summary of all the key information points which were discussed and shared. The first 2 summary reports are already available, so you can go into the UNFCCC website and find it. And the third one will be published by August 15th, so pretty soon. And then finally, a synthesis report, a factual synthesis report of all technical dialogues, which is coming up from these 3 summary reports and identifying the key messages that, from a technical perspective, are being sent forward to the political discussions. And this report is to be made available in early September. So there are key findings in these summary reports, which again are not agreed, and they are much more than what I have here, but I would like to highlight what I believe are findings which will be crucial in the discussions in Dubai. So the first one is there has been significant yet inadequate collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the Paris Agreement. So countries are making an effort, but it's not enough. Emissions are not in line with global mitigation pathways consistent with the temperature goal. So the nationally determined contributions are not enough, and on top of that, they are not being implemented in accordance with what was planned. So we are really lagging behind in terms of emissions pathways. As was referred to, emissions need to peak between 2020 and 2025 if we want to have a 50% chance of committing to the goals. I will move ahead as my time is running out, like the time to fight climate change. This was the first slide was in relation to mitigation. The second slide is in relation to adaptation. Collectively, there is increasing ambition in plans and commitments for adaptation, but there is also an implementation gap and technologies. There is an implementation gap. You will see that the messages related to adaptation are not as strong and they are not as pungent as the ones related to mitigation. And finally, in relation to finance, achieving systemic transformations in pursuit of 1.5-degree goal requires rapid deployment and adoption of cleaner technologies and accelerated innovation. The amount of international financial support for adaptation has increased, although adequacy of such support is limited compared to the scale of needs. And finally, there is a need to address the significant funding and investment gaps in misaligned flows that remain. So there is a need to look at all the financial flows and ensure their rapid alignment in relation to the goals of the Paris Agreement. Finally, what is going to happen from now until COP28 in Dubai, which is happening in the beginning of December? So this factual synthesis report is being published in September. Then countries can have submissions, so sending their views to the Paris Agreement on what they understand from this factual synthesis report and what they think is most important. And then there's going to be a specific workshop in October to discuss this topic. In addition to that, there is going to be some high-level meetings, including those convened by the United Nations Secretary General, and for instance, the pre-COP meeting, which is taking place in Abu Dhabi in October, where high-level participants will have the opportunity to discuss how to move forward. And to conclude, in COP28, there is going to be consideration of the outputs. So considering the outputs of these technical dialogues, which are going to be synthesized in this synthesis report. And so there's going to be high-level events. So high-level events are participated by ministers, but also by ambassadors and heads of state. And they will look into what the science and what the technical dialogue results. And they're finally going to create what is called the outcome of the global stocktake. This outcome can be either a COP decision or a political declaration or both. And of course, there is differences in terms of the impact of one or the other, as a COP decision is stronger as it has a legal stance. And this outcome should have both a forward and backward looking. It should basically say what we have done and not done, but also give guidance to countries on what needs to be done so that we can somehow bridge over the gap which has been created. And finally, maybe a technical annex to this decision or declaration can provide more specific guidance, scientifically and technically based guidance on what needs to be done in terms of reducing emissions, increasing adaptation, and aligning financial flows with the Paris Agreement goals. But of course, COP28 is not the end. It's actually the beginning of a new cycle of creating nationally determined contributions, which in the meantime are going to be preceded by the first biannual transparency report in 2024, then national determined contributions around 2024 or 2025. Adaptation communications are also coming, and then by 2028, a new global stocktake is going to take place, and then we go back to the original cycle. And I've overrun my time, I'm sorry for that, and there's more information about PATPA if you want to find us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your valuable thoughts and inputs on global stocktake, enhancing ambition and the Paris Agreement. Thank you once again. And now let us invite Mr. Ali Waqas Malik, Deputy Head of Mission, Embassy of Pakistan, Republic of Korea. And in his presentation, he will give an insightful suggestion for NDC's implementation in developing countries based on analysis of 2020 NDC synthesis report. So the floor is now yours, please. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ali Waqas Malik. I'm Deputy Head of Mission in the Embassy of Pakistan, Seoul. And today I will speak on the implementation of nationally determined contributions in developing countries. The sequence of my presentation will be first, I'll be sharing with you some insights from the NDC's synthesis report 2022 that was prepared by the UN Climate Change Secretariat on the request of the CMA that we all know is the governing body of the Paris Agreement. And thereafter, I will briefly present a case study from the developing countries on NDC's implementation. And for this, I will share insights from the experience of my own country, Pakistan. And thereafter, I will briefly touch upon the needs of the developing countries vis-a-vis NDC's implementation. And lastly, I'll try to come up with some recommendations. We all are aware that in 2015, when Paris Agreement was signed, all the parties to the Paris Agreement, they submitted intended nationally determined contributions that were not ambitious enough to keep the temperature goal and all other 3 goals of the Paris Agreement within reach. And these apprehensions were later verified in 2018 when IPCC presented its famous 1.5 report. And then on this slide specifically, you see an analysis of, or the key findings or insights from the analysis of all NDCs that are submitted to the UN Climate Change Secretariat till September 2022. And one of the key striking findings is that that almost 90% of the submitted NDCs, they have quantified mitigation targets. And implementation of all these targets, this report has analyzed that can lead to global GHG emissions reduction that is 10.6% higher than 2010 levels. That meaning thereby that the NDCs submitted to date are still not ambitious enough to keep the temperature goal, 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement alive. Another, again, alarming insight from the report is that even though it is better than the previous report, that now there is a stronger possibility that the global emissions will peak before 2030, but as my previous speakers, they highlighted that we need to peak before 2025, and even 2030 is not enough to keep 1.5 alive. Another I'm one of the climate negotiator as well, and I can share with you there is a huge misconception among the negotiators is that NDCs are mostly or like primarily for communicating the GHG emissions reduction targets. That is actually not the case. The developing countries like Pakistan, we are of the view and we constantly advocate that adaptation is an integral part of the NDCs. And as Mr. Gonzalo, he said that even the synthesis reports from the GST technical sessions, they are not as ambitious enough on the adaptation side. So adaptation is the lagging point. And if we just go again back to the NDC synthesis report, the message is that 80% of the NDCs submitted by the countries, they mentioned NDCs and they actually provided information on the vulnerability as well as adaptation measures, including national adaptation plans and sectoral actions. Another important thing which Ambassador Kim also highlighted that means of implementation is actually the key, and without means of implementation, it is hardly possible for developing countries to deliver on their NDCs commitments. That's why we see that almost all countries, regardless of whether they are developed or developing countries, they have mentioned means of implementation in their NDCs, and almost 44% that are primarily the developing countries, they have actually provided quantitative estimates of financial support they need for implementing their NDCs. Additionally, 58% of the NDCs, they have identified technology, some sort of technology they want to use in carrying out their NDCs commitments regarding mitigation as well as adaptation. And 74% of the countries, almost all the developing countries, they have identified capacity building as a prerequisite for NDCs implementation. These are, on this slide, you can see the key takeaways. Let me summarize them briefly. In my understanding, there are 3 key takeaways from the NDC synthesis report for me. First is that the NDCs submitted to date are not ambitious enough to keep the 1.5 degree temperature target of the Paris Agreement alive. Secondly, the scope of NDCs is not limited to the mitigation alone, and adaptation is an integral part of the NDCs. And lastly, the developing countries must be substantially supported by the means of implementation in order to deliver on their NDCs. So these are the 3 key takeaways which I can highlight from the synthesis report. Now, describing about a case study from Pakistan regarding the NDC's implementation. I was also part of this NDC, Pakistan's NDC's formulation process and now the implementation side of it. But what I can tell you is that Pakistan responded to the IPCC's 1.5 report in a big way by updating its initially submitted NDCs, and we came up with our updated revised NDCs in 2021. And we committed to overall 50% GHG emissions reductions from the projected levels in 2030. And on top of it, we've committed 15% of the GHG emissions will be done unconditionally, even if the means of implementation are not provided to Pakistan, but for the 35% will be needing finance from the developed countries. The revised NDCs, they also included new sectors that are blue carbon or healthcare and waste sector. And it also highlighted some key priority areas or high priority areas for Pakistan. For example, we have committed that 60% of our electricity needs by 2030 will be from the clean sources, renewable and clean, including hydro. And there will be a moratorium, and it's still in place, on the imported coal power plants. And then we have also committed to shift the on-road transport, 30% of it, to e-vehicles by 2030. And lastly, to increase the protected areas cover in Pakistan from presently 12% to the 15% in 2023. Soon after presenting our NDCs, the government of Pakistan, they initiated an extensive consultation process at the national as well as subnational level with all stakeholders with a view to come up with an ambitious NDC implementation plan. And for that, the consultations were held at the federal level as well as the 6 subnational government levels. One of the key aim in addition to the development of NDC's implementation plan was to help out the subnational governments to come up with their own subnational NDC's implementation plans. And as a result of the consultations, these subnational governments have already developed their 6 subnational plans, and they have identified 49 priority areas or the project interventions, which they'll be implementing in coming years for the implementation of NDCs. At the national level, the Ministry of Climate Change, they have identified almost 10 priority areas, and if you combine those 10 priority areas with the provincial plans, they have both culminated into the development of the national framework for the NDC implementation with 59 priority actions in total, with a portfolio of $2.4 billion. But it is actually, it's an initial step. It is not about the full implementation of NDCs, because full implementation of NDCs will require a lot of more money. This is just 2.4 billion. Our need for the climate finances runs in hundreds of $billions. While in our quest for implementing NDCs in Pakistan, government of Pakistan, however, is dealing with severe challenges and unique circumstances, such as the limited direct access to climate finance, especially at the subnational level. As in my previous slide, I just informed you that almost 80% of the project interventions for the NDCs will be done by the subnational governments. And to date, for example, in Green Climate Fund, there is no government entity from the subnational governments that is accredited to get access to financial resources at the disposal of the fund. So this is one big problem with that government of Pakistan is facing. Secondly, the economic challenges and primarily the public debt has also made it difficult for the government of Pakistan to borrow any additional debt-producing climate finance, even if it is provided at a very concessional rate. So it's a big issue, the indebtedness of Pakistan. And thirdly, you can see that Pakistan, being, again, because of the limited fiscal space, often the climate targets, they compete with the other development priorities of the government, mainly related to the sustainable development goals like zero hunger and no poverty. And one most important things which my previous speakers also highlighted is the vulnerability and the loss and damage. Pakistan is highly vulnerable climate country, and because of the threat of the extreme weather events or the floods, it's also the sword is hanging on the government that whatever you do in terms of climate action, it can all the benefits or the gains can be do away in one big flood. So it's again that we are at a consistent threat of these floods, and now we have started witnessing cyclones in Pakistan as well. And again, if I can go in detail, but there are some capacity constraints and at the subnational level as well in the project development and implementation. Let me come back to the implementation of NDCs, and specifically, let me talk about the needs of the developing countries vis-a-vis NDCs implementation. And I will share some insights with you from the first needs determination report of the Standing Committee on Finance of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and Paris Agreement. This report was actually mandated by COP24 to the SCF, and they were tasked to come up with a report on the needs of the developing countries vis-a-vis their developing countries' needs for the implementation of the convention and the Paris Agreement. I was part of the Standing Committee of Finance when this report was produced, and this report is actually compiled from the 9 different types of national reports, which you can see on the screen. From like adaptation communications, BURs, and all others, including the NDCs that I have underlined. I'll just highlight only one key finding of that report, and I'll not bore you with other details. The one important finding is that out of all 153 developing countries that submitted NDCs under the Paris Agreement, only 78 countries actually costed their needs. And those costed needs, if we just sum them together, they are amount to $5.8 to $5.9 trillion till 2030. So this is a big number. If we, in terms of distribute it in terms of the thematic distribution, then the costed needs in the developing countries NDCs were 37% mitigation, that was around $2.1 trillion. Then adaptation, $835 billion, and cross-cutting $2.89 trillion, that are around 49% of the total costed needs. The reality, on the other hand, is that we all know that finance is the key, and this key actually signifies that all developing countries believe that finance climate finance especially can unlock climate action, ambitious climate action in the developing countries that can keep the temperature goals as well as other goals of the Paris Agreement within reach. But again, the reality is that the current level of climate finance available to the developing countries is actually very less. Where I have told you that our need is around $6 trillion per annum, or like in total till 2030. But what we have is only a pledge that that developed countries have committed that they will mobilize $100 billion per year till by 2020 for the developing countries. And this is the report which was again produced by the Standing Committee on Finance, the $100 billion progress report, and it was presented last year at COP27. And let's go back to the last point only, that the report only confirms that the $100 billion pledge was not met in 2020. We all know that our need is in trillions, but what we are getting is not even 100 billion. And the report, the 100 billion progress report, did not actually come up with any number. This is the chart from the report, the famous lollipop diagram on which I can share with you some insights within the Standing Committee on Finance, that the negotiators from developed and developing countries, they fought so hard that this chart should not be reflected in the executive report. And in the end, it was agreed that we will not have any executive report because they don't want to show this chart. This is nothing. This is just telling you that there is no climate finance definition which is agreeable to both developed and developing countries. Developing countries are of the view that only the climate finance which is public, grant-based, or highly concessional, and that is for the climate action in developing countries, should be counted as climate finance. But the developed countries, most of them, they rely on OECD Rio markers to report on the climate finance, and that Rio markers, among other things, they do not differentiate between loans and grants, for example. So this is the point. That is why you see that according to this chart, OECD has shown that in 2020, the developed countries provided around $83 billion to the developing countries for climate action. But according to Oxfam's Climate Shadow Report 2020, these estimates are down to $19 billion. So there is a huge gap. The developing countries are saying that you are providing $19 billion. The developed countries are telling we are providing $83 billion. What we need is $6 trillion. So if the finance is not there, then again, we can have a very robust outcome on GST, but in the end, it will be very difficult to implement if the money is not flowing. Lastly, and I'll just try to hurry through this slide, some recommendations on NDC's implementation. And in NDC's implementation, I'm of the view that the NDC's implementation, especially in the developing countries, cannot be achieved if the international climate change regime cannot uphold the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility. Meaning thereby that the developed countries, I also include G20, all G20 members in that. It's my own perspective, not country perspective, that they should take the lead based on their historical responsibility and demonstrate deeper emissions cuts and GHG emission reduction targets as compared to the developed countries if you want to keep the 1.5 degree centigrade temperature target of the Paris Agreement alive. And again, lastly, you can see that the developing countries must be provided sufficient predictable grant-based public finance by the developed countries. And again, they should be supported, or support should be mobilized for the technological and the capacity building needs of the developing countries as well. Thank you very much for the patient listening.
That was a great presentation. Thank you very much for your meaningful speech, Mr. Ali Waqas Malik. And next, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Leah Gliad, Director for MRV Systems, Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. And she will give us presentation on the technical assessment of the global stock taking through the national greenhouse gas inventories under the ETF. She's now on the stage. Please welcome her with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, the organizers, for giving me the opportunity to present on this topic and this wonderful conference. And best greetings to my colleagues, my students, esteemed VIPs here. It's fantastic to see your faces, to see your interest to such a wonderful and so hot topic these days. So today I will be presenting about the technical assessment on global stock change for the national greenhouse gas inventories under the ETF. Under this dry title, we're actually talking about the other side of the coin. Not just looking at GST as the big movement between all countries to have synthesized reports and manage the monitoring of the progress towards the target. But what do we need to be aware of to understand the data and information behind those statements? And what forms the key sources and key logical conclusions that go into GST? So I want to cite the UN Climate Change Executive Secretary, Mr. Simon Steele, who said that global stocktake will end up being just another report unless governments and those that they represent can look at it and ultimately understand what it means for them and what they can do and must do about it next. So that is why I think greenhouse gas inventory is a very important concept and a great data source to monitor our progress to target, to set the target, to understand, are we doing it? The outline of today's presentation will include the overview of the greenhouse gas inventories, the metrics for the assessment of emissions and how it is done, the ETF criteria on the quality of the data, and the meaning and approaches to calculation net zero in terms of emissions and removals. Last but not the least, I will touch on historical trends of sectoral and total emissions using the examples of large group of developed countries, Annex 1 parties. So what is greenhouse gas inventory? Some of you are very deeply engaged in this process. Others touched base with it, yet others heard about it, maybe. So we are talking about greenhouse gas inventory as an accounting of greenhouse gases, or GHGs, emitted or removed from the atmosphere. The purpose of greenhouse gas inventories is not to reduce or increase emissions. The purpose is to monitor them, to record them accurately and scientifically correct. As mentioned before by the esteemed president of GIR, we are at the turning point when sporadic and random reporting under MRV and UNFCCC turns into much more systematic and frequent reporting under ETF and Paris Agreement. We all have to produce BTRs every 2 years. We can't get away with doing it every 10 years or every 5 years, etc. And the data in the BTR are the greenhouse gas data, which will drive the projections, the policy decisions, etc. So, greenhouse gases that covered under inventory include those representatives on the bottom of the slide. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, 2 groups of gases which have fluorine in the molecule, and SF6 and NF3. Policymakers will use GHG inventories to establish a baseline for tracking emissions trends, developing mitigation strategies and policies, and assessing the progress. So it's an extremely important document, which doesn't make sense if you don't really understand how it's composed, how accurate the data are, what's the interval for uncertainties, what does it mean, net emissions, gross emissions, etc. So first, the metrics for the inventories. One, and probably the most important one, is using of global warming potentials, which is the cumulative radiative forcing for both direct and indirect effects over a specified horizon resulting from the emission of a unit mass of gas in relation to, in our case, carbon dioxide. So So GWPs were developed to allow comparisons of the global warming impacts of different gases and ability to add emissions from different gases, because you don't want to add oranges and apples, right? So 1 ton of methane is not the same as 1 ton of carbon dioxide in terms of GWP. And here, I gave you the example, oh, sorry, not yet, but I will give you the example of calculating the actual impact of methane compared to carbon dioxide. So the metric we are looking at here is carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, which is recalculated emissions to that universal situation with GWPs. Also, need to be aware that the international emissions must be reported using metric system, using the units like kilotons or gigograms, which is exactly the same for the emissions themselves. So let's have a look how we go from GHG to CO2 equivalent. I already told you that we have to apply GWPs. Here is the example how we do it. We simply multiply the mass of emissions in whatever unit, and kiloton in this case, by the value of GWP. Where do we take it? The IPCC published assessment reports. They are improving as the time goes because of the science progress. And here I gave you a summary of GWPs for the main greenhouse gases, CO2, CH4, and N2O, from different reports. Currently, we are using AR4. That's why methane is multiplied by 25. Under the Paris Agreement, we are going to use AR5. Why does it sound important to you, or should be important to you? Because if a country submitted inventory 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they use different coefficients. And therefore, the totals in CO2 equivalent will be different, even if the amount of each gas is exactly the same. That is why. Now, let's have a look at the structure of the inventory by sector. So the inventory covers the economic sectors, which are grouped by energy, IPPU, waste, agriculture, and LULUCF. Energy sector includes combustion fugitive emissions from the production, storage, and use of fuels, either mobile or stationary. It emits 3 main GHGs. IPPU covers emissions from chemical reactions during industrial processes or product use, and it emits the widest spectrum of GHGs. Waste sector covers emissions associated with waste management, disposal, and decomposition, also 3 GHGs. And agriculture, emissions from livestock and management of agricultural soils, the same 3 GHGs as waste. LULUCF stands for emissions from land use change, and forestry, also 3 GHGs. Now, in the last column, you see most of the sectors have blue name source, and under LULUCF, I have green. Why? That's why. Because some countries have negative values and some countries have positive values from that sector. Why is it so? It depends ultimately on a balance between sequestration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and emissions. You can say, why do we have emissions from this sector? Well, because we convert the lands from one use to another. We cut the trees. The growing trees, they emit more carbon dioxide than they absorb. The mature trees, they remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than they emit. That's why sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. And that is why it is important to actually understand how emissions are calculated and how the totals are received. So the calculations of emissions follow this pattern. So we have activity data, which could be observations, measurements, model data, proxy data, aggregated or disaggregated, times ultimately emission factor, which could be a single value, or it could be a composite value. And I gave examples right here. Here is emissions calculated with single values, and here you can see emission factor has a quite sophisticated formula. Depending on the type of and values of emission factors, taken, say, as defaults from IPCC guidelines, or more complex sources which are nationally specific or facility specific, we have different methodological tiers of complexity and accuracy of calculations, tier 1, 2, and 3. Now, I told something about accuracy. Let's have a look at a very important component of the accuracy. If I tell you that my emissions went up by 1%, is it scientifically important or not? Well, technically, no. Because as you can see, the uncertainties of the data are way, way, way higher than 1%. We have lowest uncertainties for CO2 from fossil fuels, and they grow as we go from technological to biological systems. For biological systems, uncertainty is always higher. Now to the total emissions. We have total emissions calculated in two different ways. Gross emissions include the sectors which only emit pretty much. So that would be energy, IPPU, agriculture, and waste. Net emissions are the ones that include LULUCF as well, which could push things up or push them down. And here's a picture what it might look like if LULUCF is negative. Have a look. These are our gross emissions. LULUCF is negative. The total is below the gross. That is why it's extremely important when you do the targets or progress monitoring in NDC, you actually clearly specify, are you talking about net emissions or are you talking about gross emissions? Next is a summary of world net GHG emissions here. Why did I use net? Because worldwide, LULUCF is slight source of emissions, not zinc. And that's why you can see it contributes 3% approximately, or contributed in 2020. So on the left-hand side, you have sectoral contribution. On the right-hand side, you have the gaseous contribution. Among sectors, energy leads globally. Among gases, CO2 leads also globally. And here's an example from Annex 1 parties, which has a couple of cheerful things. First is the green line on the bottom is net emissions. They're much lower than gross emissions, so we have negative emissions from LULUCF. Second, have a look. Here are emission levels in 1990. Here we have 2020. What's bigger? We went down, which gives us hope. Next, I will speak about how the ETF ensures the quality of the data, and that's by introducing the consistent modality strategies and guidance, introducing the quality principles, and introducing the mandatory review of all BTRs for all countries, developed and developing. Here is the list of the quality principles. Finally, net zero emissions. Well, here I show you the balance. It's the balance between emissions and removals. So ones are positive, ones are negative. You want to achieve zero. The question is, which emissions we are talking about? Now, here we go. We're talking about only anthropogenic emissions associated with some kind of production of something. Now, emissions mean all direct GHG only, not only CO2. So even you see CO2 went up, CO2 went down, it might not be all. Now, another important thing is to understand that we're using global warming potentials, but there are other metrics in IPCC which are not used currently, but might be used in the future, like global thermal potentials. And last but not the least, the net emissions in the LULUCF sector also can be calculated in different methods. Under Kyoto Protocol, we use activity-based method. Under the UNFCCC convention, we're using land-based method. Here's just an example how the greenhouse gas inventories translate into NDC target. So we have originally the emissions. We applied some accounting method which helps us to understand the contribution of LULUCF. Then we applied target setting method, which also can be very different. And here we have our NDC targets in the result. Now, well, that's the next continuous of the previous thing. So I don't want to spend too much time on types of targets because you are familiar with that. But the important thing that I want you to show here is some targets are related to emissions, some targets are not. The ones that relate to emissions could be structured as absolute target between year X and year Y, like base year and the last year. It could be comparing to BAU, business as usual emissions, if no policies or measures are implemented, or it could be intensity target. Intensity means emissions divided by economic activity. Intensity targets show us clearly the decoupling between the growth of economic activities and growth or reduction of emissions. Here is the example of global assessment. So this is taken from synthesis report from UNFCCC, and you can see that there might be some hope for us because under different scenarios with different implementations we can go up or down. I hope we'll go down with emissions. And also there are some notes from the synthesis reports. I don't have time to read them, so you can see them in the booklets. Here are the different scenarios that lead to different types of emissions, and you can see that under some scenarios we're actually reaching our targets, which is great. In the last bit, I wanted to show you something which actually fascinated me. We spoke about LULUCF sector as reducer of our emissions, right? But it can be done using good science and technology. And, sorry, not thank you yet. Here is the example of synthetic trees. So these, unlike the normal trees that do not produce oxygen, but they do absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And you can plant those things in the desert. In fact, they work better in the desert, where there's a lot of sun. What do? They grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, convert it, push it through the alkali solution of sodium hydroxide, form sodium carbonate, and that carbonate is stored for millions of years under the ocean bed, which means we remove quite a lot of carbon dioxide that way. Oh, sorry, not again. Here we go. 250,000 of those trees can remove up to 22 billion of carbon dioxide, and that's in tons. So that gives me hope, that's for sure. Now, I rightfully say thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. That was very informative presentation. I learned a lot from your talk. Thank you once again. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to introduce our final presenter, Professor Yu Seung-jik, Seungmyeong Women's University. So he will going to give a presentation on monitoring progress toward 2030 NDC in Korea. So please welcome him with a warm round of applause.
예, 안녕하세요. 오늘 저는 한국의 앞에서 글로벌 스탁테이크에 대해서 말씀들을 많이 하셨습니다만은 저는 한국의 입장에서 국가 단위의 스탁테이크의 한 과정에 대해서 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 제가 오늘 드리는 말씀은 그 배경과 구체적으로 한국에서는 온실가스 감축 목표 설정뿐만 아니라 감축 목표 이행을 어떻게 관리하고 있는가 하는 것에 대해서 말씀드리고 한국의 경험에서 앞으로 더 개선할 점과 또 한국의 경험을 어떻게 공유할 수 있는가에 대해서 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 잘 아시겠습니다만은 2023년부터 모든 기후변화 당사국, 그다음에 파리 협정 당사국들은 이제 2년 단위로 국가 온실가스 배출량 통계뿐만 아니라 그 국가에서 온실가스 감축을 어떻게 이행하고 있는가 하는 그 보고서를 BTR이라고 하는 보고서를 제출하도록 되어 있습니다. 그래서 그 보고서에서는 여러 가지 내용들이 포함이 됩니다만 중요하게 저희가 관심을 갖고 봐야 되는 것 중에 하나가 결국은 국가 감축 목표 설정뿐만 아니라 그 설정된 목표를 어떻게 이행하느냐 하는 것들에 대한 내용을 포함하도록 되어 있습니다. 그래서 관련된 것에서 이제 그러한 그 이행 진전 사항을 어떻게 평가할 것인가 하는 관점에서 보시면은 인디케이터들을 제시하도록 되어 있습니다. 그래서 우리가 아는 전체 온실가스 배출량을 GDP로 나눈다거나 인구수로 나눈다거나 하는 그러한 같은 그 인텐서티, 그 집약도 지표뿐만 아니라 각 부문 혹은 국가 단위의 어떤 특징을 나타낼 수 있는 것도 제출하도록 되어 있습니다. 그래서 이러한 그 자료들은 단순한 온실가스 감축 목표 설정뿐만 아니라 향후 설정된 목표를 조정한다거나 개선시킬 때 사용될 수 있다고 보겠습니다. 그래서 이제 그런 관점에서 이제 저희 한국도 이 온실가스 감축 그동안 온실가스 감축 목표 설정에 대한 다양한 풍부한 경험을 갖고 있습니다. 그래서 그 경험으로부터 한국에 있어서는 또 이런 이행 평가도 할 수 있는 그 기반은 충분하다고 보겠습니다. 그래서 제가 이 슬라이드에서 보여드리는 것은 한국은 이미 2008년 9년부터 2020년에 그 국가 단위 온실가스 감축 목표, 그다음에 2015년에 2030년 목표를 설정해서 제출한 이후에 그동안에도 한 3번에 걸쳐서 온실가스 감축 목표를 보다 정교하게 하는 그 수정 과정을 거쳤습니다. 그런 과정에서 온실가스 감축 목표 수립을 위한 어떤 필요 자료와 그다음에 그 이행 등에 대한 자료를 축적해 왔습니다. 그러다가 2020년부터 본격적으로 이제 온실가스 감축 목표뿐만 아니라 온실가스 감축의 이행에 대한 관리도 중요하다 하는 관점에서 2020년부터 온실가스 감축 목표 이행에 대한 평가를 진행해 왔습니다. 제가 이 슬라이드를 보여드리는 이유는 그러니까 우리가 온실가스 감축 이행에 대해서 평가를 하기 위해서는 그 감축 목표가 어떻게 설정되었는가 하는 그 내용을 갖다가 먼저 파악하고 있는 것이 필요합니다. 그런데 뭐 각 국가마다 감축 목표를 설정하는 방법은 여러 가지가 있습니다만은 한국의 경우에는 매우 자세한 그 자료를 가지고선 감축 목표를 국가 단위뿐만 아니라 부문 업종별로 설정을 해왔습니다. 뭐 대분류로 했을 경우 한 400개 이상의 기술적인 정책적인 자료뿐만 아니라 세분류로 했을 경우에 수천 개의 자료를 사용해서 목표를 설정해 왔습니다. 결국은 그 나라의 감축 목표가 충분히 이행되느냐 하는 것에 대한 평가는 이와 같이 설정된 기술이라든지 정책들이 제대로 적당한 시기에 이행이 되는가, 그다음에 그 정책이라든지 그 기술이 우리가 소기에 원래 목표하였던 그런 성과를 내고 있느냐 하는 것을 파악하는 것이라 보겠습니다. 그래서 이와 같은 풍부한 자료를 갖고 있기 때문에 저희도 이제 그 감축 목표 그 이행 평가에 대한 기초적인 내용은 갖고 있다 이렇게 보겠습니다. 그래서 저희가 감축 목표, 특히 이제 이행 성과를 평가하는 데서는 크게 두 가지 방법을 채택하고 있습니다. 하나는 디컴포지션이라고 해서 어떤 온실가스 배출량을 뭐 국가 단위 혹은 업종 단위 혹은 부문 단위로 변했을 때 그거에 대한 요인을 갖다 파악하는 것이 있고요. 두 번째는 그 국가 단위 앞에서 말씀드린 그 목표 설정과 연관이 깊은 정책이라든지 또 정책의 성과 등을 나타낼 수 있는 지표를 설정해서 관리를 하고 있는 것입니다. 그래서 저희가 크게 이제 요인 분해와 관련돼서는 크게 한 4가지 측면에서 총량적으로 평가를 할 수 있다고 보겠습니다. 그래서 온실가스 배출량을 인구라든지 하는 그 사회적 특성을 나타내는 사회적인 요인, 그다음에 1인당 성장, 1인당 소득 혹은 국가 경제 생산이라고 하는 GDP라든지 하는 그런 경제적인 요인에 의한 그 변화 요인. 그 외에 좀 정책적인 파트가 들어가는 것은 두 가지로 볼 수 있겠습니다. 하나는 에너지 사용, 한국의 경우에서도 한 90% 이상 정도가 에너지와 관련되는 것이기 때문에 그 에너지의 효율을 갖다가 얼마만큼 개선할 것이냐 하는 효율 관련된 정책의 효과를 나타내는 지표가 하나 있고요. 그다음에 중요한 우리가 에너지 전환 얘기를 합니다만은 에너지의 구성, 그러니까 고배출 연료에서 저배출 연료라든지 재생에너지로 전환시키는 그 정도를 나타내는 지표, 크게 한 4가지로 분류해가지고 국가 단위 혹은 산업 단위 혹은 부문 단위로 파악을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 각 부문별로는 이런 큰 4가지 관점을 어떻게 적용하느냐 하는 관점에서는 차이가 있겠습니다만 크게 어떤 자연적인, 사회적인 현상, 경제적인 현상, 정책적인 현상, 뭐 정책 내에서도 특히 기술적인 측면과 연료 전환이라는 측면을 파악하는 그 4가지 요인으로 분석하고 있다 하는 관점에서는 동일하다고 보겠습니다. 먼저 이제 그런 구체적인 내용을 설명할 때 한국의 이제 온실가스 배출의 한 특성을 먼저 말씀드리겠습니다. 한국은 뭐 1990년 이후부터 한 그 글로벌 동아시아 금융위기가 오는 1997년 한 2000년 이전까지만 해도 연평균 경제 성장률이 9% 이상이었고 온실가스 배출량도 한 9% 이상. 굉장히 높은 경제 성장, 온실가스 배출량의 증가를 보였습니다. 그러던 것이 2000년 접어들면서 동아시아 금융위기 이후 중화공업 우선의 정책에서 우리가 이제 뭐 IT라든지 그다음에 커뮤니케이션이라든지 테크놀로지 하는 보다 고부가 가치 저배출 산업 중심으로 산업 정책이 바뀌는 과정에서 경제 성장은 여전히 한 5% 이상대로 유지를 합니다만은 이미 2000년 이후로 온실가스 배출량 자체가 한 2~3%대로 낮아졌습니다. 그러던 것이 2009년 글로벌 금융위기 이후 오늘 한국에서는 이제 뭐 제철이라든지 이제 그런 산업에서 이제 일시적으로 증서 등을 통해서 온실가스 배출량이 급증했습니다만은 2010년 이후로 보시면 한국 경제도 이제 선진국형 경제로 접어들면서 연평균 경제 성장률이 한 2~3%대로 낮아지고 배출량 자체는 한 1% 플러스 마이너스 정도 수준으로 굉장히 낮아졌습니다. 그래서 이제 저희가 보기에는 이제 한국의 경우에는 한 2015년 전후로 해서 배출량이 거의 이제 뭐 최대점에 온 것이 아니겠느냐. 물론 2018년이라고 하는 점에서는 높아졌습니다. 그러나 이제 코비드 19 영향뿐만 아니라 전반적으로 한국의 그 온실가스 배출량의 그 추세를 보시면은 한 2015년 이후로 거의 이제 정점에 있는 어떤 최대치를 도달한 수준을 유지하고 있다 이렇게 보겠습니다. 이와 같은 그 연도별 혹은 기간별 온실가스 배출량은 저희는 크게 세 가지 측면에서 보고 있습니다. 하나는 이제 2015년이라는 한 저희가 이제 뭐 국가 단위로 이제 2030년 목표의 한 기준 시점이 될 수도 있습니다만은 2015년 대비 과거에 한 예를 들어 18년, 19년이라고 특정한 기간에 온실가스 배출량이 어떻게 됐느냐 하는 것을 비교한 적도 있고, 그다음에 저희는 이제 2030년 목표뿐만 아니라 연도별 목표 혹은 기간별 목표를 설정하여 분석을 발표를 한 바가 있습니다. 그래서 그와 같은 국가 목표 대비 그 배출량 실적이 어떻게 되느냐, 그다음에 또 전년도 대비 배출량 실적이 어떻게 되냐, 크게 세 가지 측면에서 파악을 하고 있습니다. 먼저 이제 2018년, 19년에 연평균 그 2년 동안의 평균 배출량을 2015년과 한 비교를 봤을 경우에 저희가 경제 성장이라든지 에너지 그 효율이라든지 에너지 구성에 있어서는 온실가스 배출량을 줄이는 측면을 작용했습니다. 근데 정책의 효과가 좀 있는 걸로 반영할 수 있고, 다만 그럼에도 불구하고 전반적으로 증가한 이유는 경제 성장이 생각한 것보다 좀 높았고, 그다음에 인구 증가의 요인도 높은 효과라고 보겠습니다. 그런 것을 저희가 이제 그 2015년이 아니라 저희가 원래 국가 단위 목표를 설정한 것과 비교를 해봤을 경우에 2018년, 19년의 경우에는 정책의 효과가 초기에 목적한 것보다는 좀 불충분하다. 그래서 온실가스 그 배출에 영향을 주는 연료 구성이라든지 에너지 효율 같은 경우에는 정책을 하고자 하는 목표 대비 미달한 측면이 있었고, 반면에 저희가 생각한 경제 성장보다 혹은 인구 성장보다는 실적이 좀 낮은 그런 것이 발생해서 온실가스 배출량 자체는 이제 전반적으로 지금 목표한 것보다는 초과했다 하는 그런 판단을 갖다가 저희가 시기별로 그다음에 기간별로 이렇게 분석을 해오고 있습니다. 뭐 이것은 앞에서도 말씀드렸습니다만 18년 대비 19년을 얘기를 하고 있습니다. 그래서 뭐 최근에 아마 며칠 전에 2022년에 국가 단위 온실가스 배출량에 대해서 잠정치가 발표됐습니다. 그걸 갖다가 동일한 방법에 의해서 2021년 것과 비교를 해봤을 경우에는 오히려 이제 2021년에 비해서 경제와 인구 자체는 증가를 그러니까 경제 성장은 경제 자체는 증가를 했습니다만은 우리가 이제 에너지 효율이라든지 에너지 원별 구성에 있어서는 온실가스 배출량을 줄이는 방향으로 작용을 하고 있다. 특히 이제 그 에너지 효율을 나타내는 즉 에너지 소비량을 갖다가 GDP로 나눈 그 부가가치당 에너지 소비량에 있어서는 굉장히 큰 폭의 이제 하락이 있었다 이렇게 볼 수가 있겠습니다. 이와 같은 것은 이제 저희가 이제 국가 단위로 하는 예를 보여드리는 거고요. 그다음에 또 그 업종, 산업별로는 그 업종이라든지 산업, 그다음 부문별의 특성을 반영해서 굉장히 보다 더 세밀한 분석을 하고 있습니다. 지금 여기서 화면에서 보여드리는 거는 전력 생산, 우리가 이제 전환 부분이라고 할 수 있는 전력 생산의 경우에는 전력 생산량뿐만 아니라 그다음에 전체 전력의 생산에 있어서 화석 연료로 생산하는 비중이 얼마냐, 그다음에 또 화석 연료의 경우에서도 화석 연료별로 비중이 얼마냐, 그다음에 각각 화석 연료의 그 생산성, 효율성을 나타내는 지표, 그다음에 연료들의 또 같은 한 화석 연료 내에서도 어떤 카본 컨텐츠가 얼마만큼 되느냐 하는 내용도 저희가 보다 세분화돼 갖고 분석을 해서 저희가 하고 있습니다. 그래서 이와 같은 분석은 업종, 그다음에 부문별로 그 업종 고유의 특성을 반영해서 굉장히 세분화시켜서 지금 저희가 분석을 하고 있다 하는 걸 말씀드리겠습니다. 이것은 저희가 이제 앞에서 말씀드린 그 전환 부분에 대한 그걸 보았을 경우에 결국 이제 전력 생산이 늘면서 그 다음에 전체적으로 봤을 경우에 이제 2015년 대비 18년의 경우에는 전력 생산이 늘어나고 그 다음에 화석 연료의 사용 비중 자체가 늘어났습니다. 그거에 비해서 전력 생산의 효율성이라든지 그다음에 이제 화석 연료 중에 전체 그러니까 화석 연료 전체 중에서 이제 화석 연료의 효율성을 나타내는 것 자체는 좀 더 개선되는 측면으로 작용해 왔다 이렇게 볼 수가 있겠습니다. 앞에서 말씀드린 그것들은 저희가 한 정량적으로 이제 좀 약간은 애그리게이트되어 있는 그런 결과로 나타나는 배출 총량 근거에서 이제 분석을 해오는 거고요. 두 번째로 말씀드리는 것은 또 앞에서 말씀드린 그 감축 목표 설정할 때 어떤 기술을 도입해야 된다, 어떤 정책을 도입해야 된다 하는 그거에 근거해 가지고 목표가 설정되기 때문에 그와 같은 기술 정책이 도입이 되었는가 하는 파악하는 지표들을 개발을 했습니다. 그래서 그 지표를 국가 단위 혹은 부문별로 이렇게 얘기를 했습니다. 아까 앞에서 말씀하신 주 시장님께서 말씀하셨습니다만 대한민국에서 한 100개 이상의 지표를 가지고선 이걸 갖다가 분석을 하고 있습니다. 그와 같은 지표는 정성적인 지표도 있고 정량적인 지표도 있습니다. 그거 외에도 저희가 어떤 정책을 시행했느냐 시행하지 않았느냐 하는 그 이행 지표, 그다음에 그 이행 지표의 그 성과가 어떻게 나타나는지 하는 성과 지표까지 좀 다양한 지표를 포함해서 국가 단위 부문 업종별로 파악을 하고 있습니다. 네, 그래서 저희가 한 예로서 보면 국가 단위로 봤을 경우에 배출 총량을 하는 그 절대량뿐만 아니라 GDP당 배출량, 인구당 배출량, 그다음에 또 에너지당 전체 또 그 GDP 중에서 에너지를 얼마만큼 쓰느냐 하는 그런 것들을 지표를 나타내서 그 지표가 목표 혹은 전년도에 비해서 어떤 차이가 있느냐 하는 것들을 비교를 했습니다. 그래서 여기 보시면은 2021년 같은 경우에는 저희가 목표로 한 에너지 소비량이 있을 수가 있고 그것 대비 실질적으로 소비한 에너지 양이 있었습니다. 그래서 이제 액츄얼에서 타겟을 뺐을 때 이게 양의 숫자를 갖고 있으면은 목표대를 초과하는 경우고 반대로 네거티브 숫자를 갖고 있으면은 목표를 초과 달성한 걸로 이렇게 파악을 하고 수 있다고 보겠습니다. 그래서 산업이라는 전환 부분 같은 경우는 오히려 목표 대비 배출량이 낮았다 이렇게 볼 수 있고 반면에 오히려 2021년 같은 경우에는 건물이라든지 교통 부분, 수송 부분에서 오히려 목표를 초과하는 배출이 일어났다 이렇게 볼 수가 있겠습니다. 그러한 같은 그 지표는 앞에서도 말씀드렸듯이 전환 부분, 그다음에 교통 부분, 산업 부분에 대해서도 각각의 고유 특성을 나타내서 하고 있습니다. 그래서 일부분의 경우 그리고 그걸 한 그 정도를 갖다가 정량적으로 파악할 수 있는 건 숫자뿐만 아니라 저희가 색으로서 한 목표를 100% 이상 달성했을 경우에는 초록색, 한 80에서 90, 100% 정도 수준일 때는 노란색, 80% 이상의 목표가 달성됐을 경우에는 빨간색해서 빨간색 같은 경우는 보다 그 원인을 파악하고 개선한다거나 혹은 목표 자체를 갖다가 현실을 반영해서 수정이 필요한 경우 수정하는 그러한 피드백 과정을 갖다가 거친다고 보겠습니다. 예를 들어 여기서 이제 산업 부분에 우리 발런터리 어그리먼트라고 얘기하는 자발적 협약 같은 경우에는 어떤 그 가입한 그 기업의 숫자보다는 그 가입이 증가했느냐 하는 그런 지표들을 갖고서 파악하는 경우도 있다 말씀드리겠습니다. 그래서 이와 같은 저희들의 그 경험에 근거해 가지고 앞에서도 말씀드렸지만 한국의 경우에는 글로벌 그 스탁테이크뿐만 아니라 국내적으로도 감축 목표 설정뿐만 아니라 그 이행에 대해서도 굉장히 많은 관심과 어떤 정책의 그 성공 여부를 결정할 수 있다 하는 그런 관점에서 2020년부터 이행 평가를 하고 있습니다. 그래서 결국 이제 그 한국의 입장에서는 이행 평가를 할 수 있는 그 기초라든지 방법론에 대해서는 계속 개선의 여지가 있습니다만은 어느 정도 체계는 갖추고 있다 해서 할 수 있다고 보겠습니다. 이제 그와 같은 근거는 한국의 경우에는 감축 목표 설정부터 굉장히 좀 자세한 자료를 가지고서 분석한 결과다 이렇게 보겠습니다. 그리고 다만 이러한 그 이행 평가는 이런 그 감축 목표 이행에 대한 그 성과뿐만 아니라 그걸 가지고선 그 정책의 효과를 높이는 개선하는 데도 사용할 수 있고 또 그것뿐만 아니라 다음 앞으로 5년 단위로 설정해야 하는 그 감축 목표에도 목표를 갖다 설정하는 데도 귀중한 자료로 활용할 수 있다. 다만 이와 같은 이행 평가가 제대로 되기 위해서는 굉장히 많은 양의 방대한 데이터를 체계적으로 수집하고 또 그 수집된 데이터를 일관성 있게끔 잘 관리하는 것이 필요하다고 보겠습니다. 그래서 이와 같은 그 평가에는 앞으로도 계속 개선을 해나갈 것이고 아마 한국의 이런 경험들도 우리 여기에 참여하신 여러 분들과 같이 공유를 하고 또 이러한 것도 글로벌 스탁테이크에 있어서 뭐 국가 단위 평가는 하지 않습니다만은 국가 단위의 그 좋은 나은 성과들이 지속적으로 지구 온난화를 기후 변화를 완화시키는데 기여할 수 있는데 충분한 역할을 할 수 있을 거라 생각합니다. 예, 뭐 이상으로 발표를 마치겠습니다. 예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor, for sharing your insightful knowledge and information. Thank you very much once again. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we've come to the end of the presentation session. And through the 4 presentations today, we were able to gain a better understanding of the GST being discussed under the Paris Agreement, as well as the efforts and needs for NDC implementation in each country. So on behalf of all participants here today, we would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all the practitioners and experts for sharing their insights on global greenhouse gas reduction efforts.